Recording in progress.
There you go. That's what I was saying. You do that. Going through some books and references like that. Might be good to get. I think the class might be interested. Maybe a list of the books you referenced.
Yeah, the most less technical books are going to be the one that I talked about today, Sean Pilton's book. Yeah, so I actually should have I should have shown you.
But yeah, we can just do an email and
I will do
But
that.
if anybody asks for a copy of the presentation,
Okay, that's fine.
if you mind if I just share it?
Sure. No, that's fine.
Sandy's with us, right? One of the other. Judy, how are you, my dear? Good to see you. How's Lamont doing? Was he up there? Speak of the devil. Speak of the devil. He dropped you off and.
Yep.
You're not recording yet, are you?
I am, but he always cuts it off at the beginning. Yeah.
I was looking at some of the recordings that were in the start of the philosophy. When people click on the recordings that are on the website,
Oh, yeah.
it's picking up a lot of the preamble.
Oh, okay.
Hello. Okay, good.
Russ is gonna get it. Russ is.
Oh, great, thank you. I just want to check the
Maybe
videos.
you're with us in person. Thank you.
When's Ken? He's got another wedding coming up, right?
I did,
When's
yes.
your son getting-
Nice. Youngest boy's getting married
Oh, good, thank you.
mid-December.
Yeah.
Somebody found it first. Start putting more chairs out.
Give me more already.
No, I don't. Fucking right. Start. Yeah, there you go. Gary, the other day, but didn't get a chance to meet you yet. So. Thanks for being here. Yeah, we saw y'all on the Zoom last week. So glad you're with us in person.
I'm gonna go ahead and let people in.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you can, I will yield the chair distinction to you.
Francis, Hannah is first year of seminary. She is on sabbatical, so you haven't seen her.
Will you have Hannah as one of your students?
No, I'm gonna take it, this year, then I'll take it next year.
Is that it?
They just haven't started yet.
Yeah. We're just, for those on Zoom, we're just getting ready to kick things off in just a second. Thanks for joining.
Okay, here it is. Where do you want to sit?
Okay. There's a little loud now. Mute your microphone. That would be great to avoid any background noise. So, but welcome everyone. Roger Gench is with us again today to continue a discussion on dangerous memory and anti-racist political theology of the cross. That's a mouthful, but I think did I get that right? Yeah. Thank you.
That was good. That's not.
Was anybody watching TV yesterday, say about noon? It's a really good games on. You know, there was a team, wears orange. Don't think anybody watched, but did go, played very well, so just thought I'd get that little plug in there. So Presbyterian Women is sponsoring Giving Tree and are collecting gifts for STEP. And there's a collection bin at the entrance of the parking lot door. So there, I think I don't know who was here, that is it through the 28th, I believe? I believe that's through where they're collected. So if you have any, if you go on the First News Weekly, you can determine what gifts they're looking for and bring those and put them in the collection bin. Please remember that next week there is no class. That's what we celebrate holiday. So everybody enjoy your weekend. After that, Francis Taylor Gench will be with us for the first Sunday in December. So looking forward to that, and she's here with us today. So welcome, Francis.
Want to see it?
Sad news, very sad news. Irene Owen died yesterday with complications of the car accident. She was a long time class of the church, so please keep the family thoughts and prayers. Are there any other announcements, joys, or concerns to share with the class before we turn it over to Roger? If not, Roger, welcome back. Look forward to having you.
Great to be here again. Thank you for showing up for the second of these. Last week I was afraid that I buried people, and I don't want to do that. So you're really good to show up again. This is not the easiest topic in the world. One, talking about racism, and two, talking about the cross and racism. And of course, last year about this time we did James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. So those two are deeply connected, obviously, in that book, and by a lot of really interesting authors that are writing, contemporary authors. Again, we summarize a little bit of what I did last week, because I think that title, as Drake noted, that it was not the easiest title in the world, and it's a title that's going into a semi-academic publication interpretation. So that's why it's a little bit heady. Hannah, could you go ahead and go to the open slide?
I don't care. I want to hear it though.
Read. An anti-racist political theology of the cross. Again, not the easiest title to wrap your head around. Anti-racist, one thing, dangerous memory, another, political theology, another, and then the cross, another. How many things we can take the whole time just kind of explaining that. I think we got a dangerous memory last week. Anti-racist, we're going to do this morning. Especially we're going to kind of take on Ibram X. Kendi and his magnificent book, How to Be Anti-Racist. But political theology is not new.
Political theology. That's what this topic is.
Yes, good. Emphasize the point. So the political theology is not the easiest thing to kind of get at. It's been current since the time of Jürgen Moltmann's Crucified God. So we're talking about the 1970s. We talked about Johann Baptist Metz and Dorothy Solie. They're called, Elizabeth Johnson calls them the three Germans who were struggling with the cross in light of the Holocaust, in light of all that went on during, they were all teenagers in World War II, living in Germany. Two of them were conscripted into the German army towards the tail end of that. And I've been kind of going back and trying to recover, in light of our current political circumstance, trying to recover what was going on during the 1930s and 1940s, and then beyond that in Germany, and how people responded to it, how people responded to the tyranny of the Nazis, and how they responded also to the Holocaust. And surely those three authors, Johann Baptist Metz, Jürgen Moltmann, and Dorothy Solie, who came to this country, by the way, to teach at Union Seminary in New York for many years, and then she went back to Germany. And I think she's still alive. She's in Hamburg, I think, Germany. Wrote a book entitled Suffering, which was in part a response to Jürgen Moltmann's book. They were political. I mean, they coined the word political theology according to the people who have studied this movement. So that has evolved since then. And now there's a whole realm of theology called political theology within public theology. And Union Theological Seminary has just launched a new master's degree program in public theology. So that's what's interesting behind all of that. But political theology, let me just get at that a little bit. We're not talking about Democrats and Republicans, although we hope both of them can learn from our political theology. We're talking about for Moltmann and Solie and Johann Baptist Metz, political theology was a contrast and counter to domesticated theology or privatized theology that was going on, in particular in Germany in the 1930s and then in the 1940s. In fact, Karl Barth, the great theologian, a Reformed theologian, who almost everybody still studies, and I think as they should, probably one of the most noted theologians of the 20th century for us as Protestant and Reformed or Presbyterians. He noted that if the churches had not remained silent in the early 1930s, the Nazis would have never gained the stranglehold that they did. Now that's quite a statement, but it also, but it does point to the power of the church in Germany at that time, a power that we might reflect on even in our time. There was a very, very interesting on point just this week. Maybe some of you heard it on, and if you haven't heard it, go and listen to it on evangelical theology, on the evangelical churches, and two theologians were talking about the racism that is going on in the evangelical movement. And Thea Butler in particular was one of the ones who was on point. And you spend an hour with that, it's well worth your time. So I mean, in essence, we're talking about, you know, how people are doing political theology for bad or for good. But political theology is actually about addressing the current situation and abuses of power, large and small. And that's the way the political theologians that I've listened to and that I've read, that's the way they articulate that. And so it is counter to privatized theology, domesticated theology that doesn't get into the public realm, but actually engages the public realm. And but engages it in very particular ways. A political theologian at Duke University, Luke Brotherton, pointed out something I had never seen, and one of the reasons I asked for the hymnal was I wanted to get both the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, where it says, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. He says that's the essence of political theology, right there in the Apostles' Creed. And I wanted to get the Nicene Creed. It used to be in the old hymnal. They used to be right next to each other. But the Nicene Creed does basically the same thing, has that same language. It identifies the particular political ruler that put Jesus to death. That was subject. That was an example of the abuse of political power. It identifies that particular one, but it also identifies Mary, a poor peasant, who bore Jesus, a poor peasant who proclaimed the reign of God and lived it in his life. And it was not a privatized reign of God, it was a public reign of God. And so, you know, the person that came, I may have mentioned this last week, sorry if I'm repeating, but I just never forget on Christmas Eve 4 or 5 years ago, at my former church, New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. Somebody walked out after the Christmas Eve service and said to me, "How dare you politicize the gospel?" And he was incensed. And I said to him, we read the Luke passage. It starts with Caesar Augustus. Did you hear that? And then it proclaimed the one who was born as Savior. That's a counter to the Savior of Caesar Augustus. Political theology is all over the biblical text. It's just unmistakable. So political theology ought not to be a controversial notion, although I'm sure it is for a lot of people. It's all over the Bible. And when you even say the kingdom of God, which some people don't want to say, they don't want to use the word king, so they'll take out the G. Fine with me, but it's still a political reality. It's what we're talking about. But that's what God is about, and is very, very, as Luke Brotherton says, it's very, very specific to a particular context. So he points out something that's really quite extraordinary. He says right here in the Apostles' Creed, they're pointing out the particular context of political tyranny and abuse that Jesus encountered. Pontius Pilate. And then Luke Brotherton said, Pontius Pilate, therefore, is a symbol for all political powers in local places that we've got to attend to, because Jesus had to contend with this in his life. So political theology is very particular. In fact, I don't think political theology of the cross is an atonement theology as it is a very practical theology that asks questions about power and the abuse of power, large and small. So the cross, the political theology of the cross does not get into the atonement theories that maybe you've heard, and I don't want to get into all that. Political theology of the cross talks about abuses of power, large and small. My teacher, Doug Otati, put it this way. We used to teach it in seminary. He put it this way: it's the crosses that litter the landscape of the world. And so that's what we're looking at with political theology now. What we're doing in this particular segment is applying it to racism, which is at the heart and core of our American experience. I just noted the New York Times that had published the 1619 project, and they just come out with a new book on it. I just ordered it. It really looks magnificent. Even Kendi is in it, Brian Stevenson, a bunch of authors that have been writing on this stuff for many years. And a book study would be very interesting on that book for us to get engaged the church on these topics. So that's enough for that. I think we got a dangerous memory last week, because what political theology of the cross in essence does, we said last week, is it exposes abuses of power, large and small. It disrupts them and then agitates us to do something about it in light of the fact that God is being revealed in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So in the resurrection of Jesus, which in political theology is a political act, it's not just a privatized act that saves you and me for heaven. It's a political act. And if you look at Paul's letters, almost always in the introduction, especially look at the book of Galatians and the very beginning of it, the resurrection from the dead is counter to Caesar right from the get-go. So when Jesus is raised from the dead, what we're saying is that the politics of Jesus is God's politics for us. And that's the life, death, and resurrection is what he is about. And so that's kind of, and that can be a very dangerous thing in any context, but especially in our context, in the polarized world in which we live. And so, Hannah, if you would go to the first slide. So this is actually the first paragraph of my article. I'm going to talk about this moment we're living in as a Kairos moment of racial reckoning, when we are grappling with the painful consequences, the consequence of painful history of racism and slavery. Now, the notion of Kairos, I think you're familiar with. It's the Greek word that has to do with God's involvement in history in the chronos of history. And chronos is the Greek word for time, which is sequential time. Kairos is when there is a moment where a significant moment. And we talk about Jesus, the moment of Jesus, as a kairos moment. And so it's a moment in which there is a particular revelation of who God is and what God is doing in our specific context. So it's not just an abstract notion. It asks the question, what is God doing in our specific context amid the racial reckoning that we're living in? That's why I talk about this as being a kairos moment. I think it's even becoming more so. Some people are saying we're seeing more backlash than we're seeing any progress. But I mean, the fact that we're living in tension and we're seeing backlash, to me, makes all the difference in the world. That means something's happening. Did you hear I don't know if you heard some of the medical experts talk about the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine, and when they said if you have a reaction to that vaccine, that's good, because that means your immune system is reacting and it's engaging. So in a similar way, what we're seeing, I mean, it's not good. Backlashes are not good, but we're seeing them. And that means we're struggling mightily with this stuff. And so we're living in the tension of this very moment, which is a kairos moment. And it's a moment that is exposing stuff that we don't like to see, and that's what makes it dangerous. It disrupts it. That's what makes it dangerous too. And it agitates us, and then it compels us to be about what God is asking us to be and do. So if you could go to the next slide, Hannah. We did this last week. This is the most haunting quote from Eddie Glaude's book, Begin Again. It's a book. Eddie Glaude is professor of religion and African American studies at Princeton University. And that is a magnificent book on James Baldwin. But this quote, I cannot think of a quote that I've read in the last several years that more summarizes what the situation we're living in right now. Baldwin's moral vision requires a confrontation with history, with slavery, and the ongoing consequences of the aftertime, short of the rosy tint of American innocence, in order to overcome its hold on us. Ours, he says, is a cold civil war. We have those who are desperately holding on to the vision of the United States that never really made sense, at least to me, and those who are fighting for the birth of the new America. But even in the fight, the divisions of the country feel old and worn. Today feels like we're fighting old ghosts that have us by the throat. Wow, that is a powerful notion. I told you the political cartoon last week of in the Washington Post occurred before the last election. So 5 weeks ago. And it had Union reenactors and Confederate reenactors standing in a field, and the person that was orchestrating the whole thing said, "Now today we are going to reenact the school board meeting." That's supposed to be funny. Of course, it's not funny because but again, there's tension, and if you can see through it, this is a good thing because we're struggling towards something. So Hannah, let's go to the next slide. Probably one of the most important books I've read in the last 2 years is Sean Copeland's Knowing Christ Crucified, The Witness to African American Religious Experience. And Drake, this is one that I would commend to you all. It's not the easiest book in the world, but it is a readable book. And this is what she says, that Christian theology must stand at the foot of the cross and not remain silent before the tears of a crucified world, the tears of crucified people. For Copeland, standing at the foot of the cross entails accountability for crucified people, past and present. In the American context, this demands a grappling with what she describes as dangerous memory of chattel slavery. Though some contend that we are living in a post-racial world, the reality of racialized violence disrupts any false assumptions and awakens the memory of crucified people in American history of enslavement. That memory, the living Black ancestors who enflesh it, disrupt amnesia about racism in our history and culture. And so if you could go to the next slide, Anna. Let me see. This is one of the things that when I've been doing the theology of the cross, often it comes up when Jesus says, "If you are to be my disciples, you must pick up your cross and follow." I'm not getting the exact words he uses, but it's in all three synoptic gospels. That is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it occurs in basically the same spot in each gospel. It is probably one of the most important statements about the cross. And it is there's a lot of interpretive literature around this, but this is the way I interpret that what Jesus is asking us to do as disciples, as we pick up the cross, is to embody an alternative reality, the kingdom or reign of God, which entails a dangerous process of naming and resisting the crosses of suffering that many already bear in the world, that we may already bear. And we're talking about abuses of power, large and small, again, aware of the fact that it may evoke backlash. And that's what we're talking about. That's why, in my opinion, what we're living through is large-scale backlash. Such cross-bearing is dangerous because it disrupts the status quo, elicits reaction, even persecution. In our current historical moment, there's no doubt that racism is the dominant cross bearing down our landscape, the dominant cross of American history and culture. Therefore, disciples of Christ are called to a nonviolent resistance of its savage forces. I don't think I want to read any more of that. Hannah, if you would go ahead to the next one. I think this is perhaps one of the most telling verses for me in Paul's letters, and it comes to the third chapter of Paul's letter to the Galatian Christians, where he makes this just almost enigmatic comment. He says, "Oh, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited as crucified." Now, where it occurs, that's Galatians, right in the middle of that letter. And it occurs there, and when you read it, you think, what in the world is he talking about? The Galatians were in Asia Minor. They were not there when Jesus was crucified. And you look at the commentaries, and I'm sorry, some of those commentary interpretations are lame as they can be. I am sorry. But Davina Lopez, a Paul scholar, has this piercing observation about this verse. She says, Paul's Galatians did not need to see Jesus crucified in Palestine. They did not see it. They did not have to see it. There were plenty of examples before everyone's eyes in real life, in stone, on coins, of capture, torture, bondage, and execution of others, all in the name of affirming Rome's universal sovereignty and domination. Cross-bearing in this context is a process, in other words, of naming those things. And that's what at least Davina Lopez and some Paul scholars say that Paul is trying to tell the Galatian people. You've got to name it. You've got imperialism all over the place, and we've got to name these things. So Hannah, if you go to the next slide. This is my bold attempt to name it. So I find myself wondering what Paul would write to 21st century American Christians about our own failures to recognize and name the crosses of racism and suffering dominating our imperial landscape and our collusions with it. This is what I imagine he might say. "Oh, foolish American Christians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Freddie Gray were publicly exhibited as crucified. In our days, these crucifixions are recorded on cell phones, and the image of them even more widely disseminated than even Paul could imagine. So we are without excuse." Some of this stuff is so current, it's almost painful to read that. I mentioned Freddie Gray because that was a particularly painful moment for me personally, because I served in a parish in Baltimore for 12 years. And we worked in Freddie Gray's neighborhood, the community organizing organization. The churches in that neighborhood were well organized. And the unemployment rate in that neighborhood still to this day is 35%. There are crucifixions, large and small in that area. So when that happened, I was in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I saw it happening, and I thought to myself, oh my God, where are they? And I kept looking and looking and looking and then saw a street name and I realized, oh my God, that's about 8 blocks from my former church. Oh, you foolish American Christians, who has bewitched you? Sorry, I'm going to start preaching in 1 second. I don't want to do that. So if you could go to the next slide. Before I go into Candy, I've said a whole bunch, and I don't mean to. I didn't give you a lot of time for reactions. So let me just reactions. Questions, observations, disagreements, yes.
Just this week, the lawyers that sit down with pastors in the courtroom,
Say that again.
the lawyers sitting down with pastors in the courtroom.
So that happened in just this week? Is that what happened? In Georgia?
Senate trial. And then about the Wisconsin, how can that man carry a gun going down the street? Because of the color of his skin and get off? It's just unbelievable.
Thank you. Yes.
May I suggest that because there was a show of keeping the law and keeping them from destroying property, there was no reaction to the Kenosha trial jury decision, and that the absence of display of the government maintaining the law and order brought the first situation to bear, for he felt he needed to protect property.
Well, I mean, you know, you can say no reaction, meaning there was no formal protest in Kenosha. Is that what that's what you mean? Among my friends, there was plenty of reaction. And one of the things you might think about, Kelly Brown Douglas wrote a book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, which is another book that I would commend to you. What she talks about is stand your ground culture, which is protecting whiteness, large and small. That's what she talks about, stand your ground. And she's talking about stand your ground laws in particular in Florida. But she was, but those laws are replicated in plenty of states. And so that is, to me, the backdrop of that story is a stand your ground culture, which incites people to violence against anything that would threaten whiteness. My interpretation. We can disagree. So, any other reactions?
I have heard you say more than I have heard any white minister say in the last 20 years. But yet the black ministers are always out front, stating this problem and bringing it to everyone's attention. What happened to the great moral white leader that should be out there saying the things that you're saying loudly in public?
Well, I'm going to take a huge amount of credit because there's a lot of soul searching that's gone on in my life for the last 30, 40 years. All of my churches have been in urban areas. All of my churches have been involved in community organizing, and all of my churches have been involved in racial struggle in one way, shape, or form. It has not been without tension that I've gotten to this point. And I must say that every morning I get up and read more, the more I realize that I am a work in progress. And I think most white ministers feel the same thing. I think probably part of the problem is this. And, you know, look, there's a book that I mentioned on Point, and Thea Butler was interviewed, and there's another person who was interviewed. Her book is, I can't remember the title of it, but it's on the racism in the evangelical movement. I grew up Baptist, by the way, and I grew up Southern Baptist at that. I grew up in northern Missouri, which was the far reaches of the Southern Baptist Convention at that time. So that kind of dislocated me in a variety of ways because Catholics were the dominant Christian group, and so but I went to Southwestern Baptist Seminary in Texas, and that was my original seminary before I became Presbyterian. That's almost 43 years ago. It is a pervasive reality, and it is it was both on the one hand, a privatizing notion, and that is religion is about me and God and my being saved. But as it gets into culture, it is, according to Anthea Butler, it is about preserving the whiteness of the reality in the world that we live in America. So I mean, it's a tough reality to kind of counter if you're evangelical. If you're mainline, you've got people that disagree, and so you've got to live with the kind of tension. And a lot of pastors, that's a tough thing to do. And by the way, I'm realizing I'm not fully answering your question, but I think in my mind, it's not just the pastors, it's the churches. And I told you last week a story that I think was one of the more significant experiences I had in the last 2 years with racism. It was a church in Virginia Beach, situated in a political reality that was not the same as the people who wanted to do a book study on Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist. And there were 12 people that wanted to do this study, and somebody put them in touch with me, and I did a Zoom study with them, 4 weeks of Zoom study. And at the end of that Zoom study, they kind of, they said, okay, now what do we do with this? And they hum-hawed around, and they had a lot of some really good comments and good suggestions. And finally, somebody said, but there's only 12 of us, what can we do? And I had my only moment, real light bulb moment. And I said, oh my God, there are 12 of you. Do you get it? There are 12 of you. And they took it on. And they took it to their session. And they did a whole thing on racism. That is the King Trent Presbyterian Church in Virginia Beach. But also it's joining with other churches, Black churches, brown churches. There are people in all of these churches that want to move and take action. So I mean, I think it's about connecting the people that want to do something. It's not just about the convincing others about something. I'm chasing too many rabbits here. I'm sorry. Ibram Kendi, at the end of his magnificent book, Stand from the Beginning, says there are 3 things that have not worked. Altruism has not worked against racism. It's just not worked. Uplift suasion, which has been one of the most liberal ways of doing it. Says so Blacks have to become like white people. Never a good idea. And then education, strikingly, says education hasn't worked. Because you can educate people to death and they still follow their self-interest. What he says is you've got to change policies. You've got to gather enough people to change policies. And then so that we can see then that it is in our mutual interest to follow these things. Now, let me give you another book that I'd love to do this book with you sometime, but you ought to read this book. The best book that I've read since Kendi is Heather McGee's The Sum of Us. And the gist of that book is that it is in diversity is in everyone's interest. Just to give a couple of examples. In affordable housing, getting for people of color who have been disenfranchised from housing, giving them a foothold in neighborhoods, giving folk a foothold economically and otherwise, a living wage. It helps everybody. Everybody benefits. Tax revenues go up, schools go up, neighborhoods go up, values go up. And so the gist of what she wants to say is that instead of seeing a sum zero economy, what we need to see is a win-win economy where there's mutual interest all about. And that's what Ibram Kendi wants to say too. Why don't we just go to Ibram Kendi? Oh, we're right there, sorry. This is, I think, somewhat, at least my weak attempt to summarize what he is saying here. He wants to, let me just read the bold. One either believes the problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist, or locates the roots of problems in power and policies as an anti-racist. Note what he says here, locates the problems in power and policies as anti-racist. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between space of being not racist. And what he wants to talk about are powerful economic, political, cultural self-interest that are behind racist policies, and they have been from the beginning, he says. So changing the policies, enabling people to see that this is in everyone's interest to do so. That's the gist of what Kendi wants to say. And churches can be helpful in that. Not only helpful, they can be a vital force in it. Let's go to the last paragraph. This is me. I find Kendi's comments astute observations to talk about political theology of the cross I've been articulating. Clearly, racism, which finds expression in both public and personal abuses of power, have been predominant crucifying power through American history. But as Sean Copeland contends, the cross of Jesus can disrupt our amnesia of Black crucified bodies by initiating us into a community that remembers his suffering and enables us to see the plantation is not a relic of the past. That's Sean Copeland. That's a haunting statement, isn't it? But it gets reinscribed in the present. We can embrace the dangerous memory because, and this is Sean Copeland again, a loving God will hold us in our risk and will not allow us to forget and will hold us in hope. It is the very spirit, I believe, this is me, the very spirit of the crucified and risen Christ that empowered his disciples to disrupt crucifixions in their midst and to agitate for liberating, transformative, reparative policies to promote the flourishing of life for minoritized people. Now, from there in the essay, I go into the living wage campaign that I talked about last week that we conducted in Baltimore. Many of you know that Baltimore's Inner Harbor is the economic engine of Baltimore. It was a revitalized old harbor that was old shipping, but it long become defunct. And it became the economic power, and some $2 billion of subsidies was spent on the Inner Harbor between the mid-1960s into the 1990s when I was involved with the living wage campaign, and none of those jobs had produced almost no living wage jobs. It had produced money for the elite, the people who produced it, but it had produced no living wage jobs. And especially for the Black residents of the city of Baltimore, who were promised time and again by political officials that this is going to be an economic engine for the city. It was going to lift up. It was going to lift up everybody. It was going to provide. It was going to help everybody to create a life. It was not creating a life, and so we began the living wage campaign. And I won't get into the specifics of that campaign, but we eventually did pass one of the first living wage bills in the country, and it was actually targeted at city service jobs. We raised from $4.15 an hour to almost $10 an hour, which mid-90s was pretty good, and it was one of the most powerful things that I on my tombstone, which I hope I don't never have, by the way. On my tombstone, I hope it says he was part of the living wage campaign in Baltimore in 1996. But how is that? So the question you answered, might ask, how is that countering racism? How is that an anti-racist activity? And how was the living wage an anti-racist policy? And the answer to that question is because people of color are the ones who were primarily hurt by the wage structures in America. That's what Kendi says too, by the way. I have a quote from him saying that. So that's putting, so that to me was an answer to the question that I asked at the very tail end of that paragraph. How might people of faith discern constructive ways to live into this calling? And that was for me. a way of doing it. So that's the question I would put to you all. How can we live if, you know, if it's possible for us to live into that kind of a calling, to live into an anti-racist vision of the world, and to how do we embody? I'll just let you sit with that. Any observations, questions again?
Sometimes I've heard you talk about the Good Nightmare and Good Friday.
That's the closest thing I probably have to what I would call an atonement theology. My teacher, Doug Ottati, told me, this is actually in his most recent book, his big magnum opus, his systematic theology, when he's actually getting into the theology of the cross, by the way, and atonement theology. He points out that many people have gone back to Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and they've analyzed that story as for its profound psychological, social effects. And what's interesting about that story is, you may remember, Scrooge was not compelled at all by moral suasion. There were plenty of people that were telling him he ought to do this and he ought to do that. He was not even compelled by his lone employee who had a very sick son. Didn't care. What did it take? It took a trilogy of nightmares. I would call them crucifying nightmares. So Mary Solberg, a Lutheran theologian who is articulating Luther's theology of the cross, talks about the cross knowledge. And the first stage of cross knowledge is like waking up from a nightmare. Waking up from a nightmare. So it's not moral suasion that works. It's being confronted, like Paul on the road to Damascus. Do you remember what Jesus says to him in the vision? Why aren't you persecuting me? In other words, here's the crucified and risen Jesus saying to Paul, who is himself crucifying Christians, Paul has to wake up to a crucifixion in his own life. In other words, it's like waking up from a nightmare. And I don't like the word woke, by the way. So I'll just talk about waking up from a nightmare. The reason I don't like the word woke is because it's become so politicized. But you know, if there's anything that I will talk about, it's just what you just said, like waking up from and to it doesn't mean. And by the way, the reason I don't like the way, for me, the word woke is because I am a good Presbyterian and I go to church every Sunday and confess my sin, and I see myself in that confession of sin. I don't have any problem with that. And yet I am continuing to see areas where I'm blind to something. And as a white person that has stuff baked into me from the very moment of my birth, I'm continually awaking from a nightmare. And that's what I think it maybe takes. I don't know. Yes. Okay. I'm sorry I talk so much. I'm well, yeah, but it's gotten worse since I'm retired. I sit around the house all day, and when I get into people, I just start talking. It's a terrible thing. Questions, observations? You can push back. Yes.
Here's a question I have. Do you find that you get some agreement or a lot of agreement about the what, but then when the hard work comes about the how, it gets a whole lot harder?
Oh yeah, of course. And this is why I love community organizing, because you know, we don't ever go into a situation where we think we've got the answer that we're going to impose. But you're bringing me to another, if you don't mind, another point, if I have just a few moments to make it. One of the things that we do in community organizing, with a rule that we always follow, and the founder of the organization that I've worked with, the Industrial Areas Foundation, which was founded in the 40s in Chicago, was Saul Alinsky, said, "You never do for others what they can do for themselves." And in order that, and he called that an ironclad rule. In order to do that, you've got to listen. So for people like me, the first thing that are white, male in particular, heterosexual, first thing I got to do is shut up, which I haven't done today, I'm sorry. Shut up and listen. And then, and there's something behind that, which comes from liberation movements in South and Central America called, it's a highfalutin name, I love talking about it. The epistemological privilege of the poor. Yes, that means the knowledge base of the poor. Heather McGee talked about it in another way. She talked about the wisdom of the Black woman. And the wisdom of the Black woman is a triply oppressed person whose perspective, that doesn't mean that the wisdom, that doesn't mean that there's better science, that doesn't mean there's better this, that, and the other. It means if you want to know what's going on the ground, there's certain people you need to talk to and listen to, right? And then if you find something, and then when you find something there, stand in solidarity, co-agitate with them. So that's in part an answer to that question. But no, you're right. It demands compromise. It's why it's maddening what's going on in Congress right now. You know, with this Build It Back Better bill. I don't know where you're at with that, but I find this a maddening process. You know, it's just, so in community organizing, we're more than willing to say, look, we may not get everything we want. So we may be disappointed, but we're going to get something for those folk whose voice had not been heard. That's the key for us. We're going to get something for people whose voices have not been heard, and whose needs need to be addressed. And that, to me, is the key for us, because we always say in community organizing, we always say organizing is reorganizing. So we never think a bill or this bill, the living wage bill, was the first start of a process of doing a variety of other things. So we just, you start one place and then you start organizing again, right? So if you have to compromise and you lose on something, okay, but that doesn't mean we're going away. We're just going to come back in a different form, right? And start over again.
Well, Nancy makes a great point, and so it's like, what policy needs to be passed? What needs to be provided to create that equity that can't be provided by the people that need it? It's like, what needs to be, you just said, don't provide anything that they should provide themselves. So the trick is figuring out what policy and what financial and what opportunities need to be provided that can't be provided by the oppressed.
So again, I think Heather McGee, that's a great place to start. She has a lot of great ideas in that book. But again, political theology is always local. And so there are people we need to be listening to right here in Michigan, right here in our own community. And there is an immense amount of wisdom there. And just as important for me to say this, because I always miss this. When I was I always had to be reminded of this in community organizing. And it's not about being altruistic. It's seeing how everybody wins by following this. So that's what Heather McGee, the brilliance of that book, is she's showing that there's a lot of stuff out there. Most of the stuff, living wage bills, affordable housing, giving people an anchor in neighborhoods. Everybody wins. It's in all of our interest. That's the power. And to me, that's power. And to me, that's resurrection. That's where resurrection's happening. It's where mutuality gains a. So I had a Black pastor in in Washington DC, after the 2016 election, sorry to get political here. But he said to me, I have people saying to me, I don't want to work with white liberals anymore. And oh my God, what are you saying? He says, I'm a white liberal. But what he was saying there is this, I want to work with people who have skin in the game and see it. And if you see that I've got skin in this game, then we can have mutuality and power and work together. And that's what changes things. Okay.
All right, Roger, thanks so much. The last 2 weeks. And Francis, we look forward to another Gench piggybacking behind Roger. So we'll look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. But thanks everyone for joining. Just a few thoughts picking up where Roger was talking about how people of faith doing things in constructive way. I'm thinking what the church, our own church, is doing here with risk organization. Rich Pater's involved to strengthen our communities, and even I know some people are involved with coming to the table, which involves listening. So we are, I think, as a church, plugging into a lot of this. I know a lot of you are involved. So Roger, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Very relevant topics. So
Thanks for having me
so much. And remember, no class next Sunday, and everybody have a great, safe, and happy Thanksgiving. Class next Sunday, George? No class. You can show up and